think we could get started. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our Solve Climate by 2030 webinar series for the state of Massachusetts. I'm Mary Fischer. I'm the Manager of Sustainability Programs here at Brandeis, and I'm here with my colleague, James G.
Hi, I'm James G. I'm Florence Levy K Fellow of Environmental Economics at Brandeis University.
Fantastic. So a little bit about what we're here for tonight. So we are doing this webinar, which is one of over 100 worldwide. And the goal of the webinar is to discuss solutions, climate solutions, how we can solve climate by 2030. Our leading climate scientists have said in no uncertain terms that 2030 is the year that we really reach the tipping point in terms of the limits to our actions to reduce the worst effects of climate change. So we are here tonight to talk with our fantastic guests. We are very pleased to welcome Dr. Jennie Stevens and Professor Tibor Toth from the Brandeis International Business School. And if you just bear with me 1 minute, I'd like to do their very fantastic introductions. They are both very experienced, and so I'm going to take a moment to introduce them. So starting with Dr. Stevens. Dr. Stevens, do you mind if I call you Dr. Stevens? Do you have a preference? So Dr. Stevens is, you have a number of roles at Northeast. So you're the director of the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs at Northeastern and the Dean's Professor of Sustainability Science and Policy. And you're also the director for strategic research collaborations at Northeastern University's Global Resilience Institute. Your recent book, Diversifying Power, Why We Need Anti-Racist Feminist Leadership on Climate and Energy, was recently published in 2020. And I've heard you call your book a call to action on why we need to change the perspective, change that male-dominated technocratic perspective on climate change to include more diverse voices. And so we're really looking forward to hearing your perspective tonight. So welcome.
Thank you.
And Professor Toth, you are you're an adjunct professor at the Brandeis International Business School, but sort of your day job, if I may, is you're the managing director of investments at the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. So you are sort of on the ground investing in these clean tech companies who are sort of taking us to this next level of bringing us toward the clean energy future. So welcome to you. Thank you for joining us tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So our format this evening is a little bit of a just kind of panel chat. I think most of us these days are pretty webinared out, so we're not going to be doing sort of slides and presentations, but we're just going to have a conversation. So I encourage everyone in attendance to chat with each other and also submit questions via the Q&A. And we're also going to be giving time a little bit later on, so you can raise your hand and actually ask our guests a question, so we can make this as interactive as possible. So as I was preparing for tonight, I noticed some similarities between both of our guests tonight. So Tibor, in the world of finance and investing, you, an organization, help fund the transition to renewable energy. Would you say that's correct?
Yes. Yeah, and much more than that, but yes, absolutely.
Yes, of course, much more than that, right? So we'll definitely get into that. And Jennie, you look at the social and political aspects of that transition. So we have kind of a really cool set of guests where we have someone who's kind of on the ground doing the actual funding, and then someone who's looking at these broader impacts of that clean tech transition. And I also noticed another similarity, which is that you both have degrees in engineering, and yet your job titles are not engineers. So I think that's really fascinating too. We have a lot of students who are joining us this evening and who are going to be watching this webinar. And I think that's a really interesting perspective to bring up, that, you know, the thing that you have a degree in is not necessarily your title as you go forward in life. So I really appreciate that, because I share that as well. So what I wanted to do is just give each of you a few minutes. I'd like to just hear about what you are kind of working on at this moment, and kind of what your day-to-day work looks like. As I said, we have a lot of students who are going to be joining us, and I think it would be really valuable for them to kind of hear about what you're kind of doing in your day-to-day. So Jennie, if we could start with you, I'd love to hear.
Sure, thank you, and thank you for having us, and look forward to the conversation. So I, as you mentioned, I've trained in science and engineering, and I'm now a professor in a policy school. So I've always been interested in the science, policy, technology interface. And I think one of the things that I've learned working on climate and energy for my whole career, so over the past 20, 25 years, is that I think we spend we've invested too much emphasis on the technology. Obviously, the technology is really important and fundamental, but we haven't invested the same amount of attention and money in social innovation, right? So that includes the kinds of organizations and policies, and when we don't pay attention to the social as much, we also miss the social justice implications of what we are doing. So my work really focuses on broadening our climate policy conversations. So we don't think about climate in a narrow decarbonization way, which is important, and the goals for net zero and focusing on emission reductions are critical. And in order to be effective in the transformations that we need to our climate policies have to be much broader than that, and need to connect with economic justice and jobs, and need to connect with healthcare and food systems and transportation and housing. And so that's kind of where I spend a lot of my time, in both my research and my teaching, in my role as a university administrator, thinking about what's the role of higher education. And we're at Northeastern right now, we're working on a climate justice action plan rather than a climate action plan, to broaden that conversation. So we're not just talking about greenhouse gas emission reductions. We need to talk about greenhouse gas emission reductions, but that's not all, right? That's only the beginning of what needs to change. So that's kind of an overview. It's a really exciting time to be thinking about and working on all of these issues and the intersection of these issues. And I think with the pandemic, it's been revealed how many inequities and disparities there are, including in our energy policies and our incentives for renewable energy. And so we really need to make sure our public investments are large and supportive of people and what communities need. And we need to focus on those communities and households that have been underinvested in for too long.
Absolutely. There's a lot there. There's a lot I want to come back to on that for sure. But Tibor, I'd love to hear from you as well.
Terrific. And I think to explain my job, I'll start with a little bit of an introduction on MassCEC, and then how I fit into MassCEC and what I do with my team. So you described us as funders, and I would say that in many ways we are, let's say, the innovation arm of clean energy and climate for the state. And that does end up meaning that, so we're not setting policy, we're about sort of execution and making things happen on clean energy side, primarily around focus and market development and helping to sort of commercialize deployment and then in many ways kind of handing off to the private sector or other mechanisms that are doing the broader scale up and deployment. More generally, MassCEC is a quasi-public agency focused on economic development in this clean energy sector. Our mission is to grow the clean energy industry and help the state achieve its climate, environmental, and economic development goals. Our vision on how we're doing that is on the one hand, sort of where we're trying to get to is focusing on sort of electrifying the big emission areas within climate of buildings and transportation, electrifying the energy use, and decarbonizing the grid so that electricity is coming from green and renewable sources, and really enabling that through efficiency and smarter grid and a sort of efficiency really throughout the, from generation to consumption of energy and electricity. And and the funding that we provide as an agency is focused on the innovation side. We're helping to fund research, we're helping to fund startup companies, we're helping to fund the kind of ecosystem of incubators and accelerators and other sort of organizations. We have probably our most used program is our internship program, where I know Brandeis and Northeastern have a lot of their students going to work in clean energy jobs that are facilitated through MassCEC and subsidized through MassCEC. And then within my team at MassCEC, I run our investments division. And so we basically are a venture capital arm within MassCEC. We are focused on working closely with other investors, with entrepreneurs, with incubators and accelerators, incubators like Greentown Labs, accelerator programs like Mass Challenge and Clean Tech Open, and really being a resource to help startups with a strategy of trying to find companies that we think have a huge potential impact on our mission, huge potential commercial opportunity, and where there's some additionality for MassCEC to be impactful on the company through our funding and support and advice, cheerleading, et cetera, that we provide to our companies. And so since joining MassCEC in 2013, we've closed on over 30 new investments. We've participated in over 80 rounds of financing. According to PitchBook, we are actually the #1 most active VC investor in clean tech in Massachusetts. So we've really kind of made an impact there. And we have a lot of kind of exciting, impactful companies that I'd love to talk about that we see poised to really make a difference. And there's a lot going on in sort of new climate bill that was just turned into law that I'm sure we'll get into and things like that. But that's so my daily job, I guess I didn't really answer that question, is we spend a lot of time getting to know startups, funding companies, sitting on boards and otherwise working with startups and advising them. So I'm on half a dozen boards in portfolio companies, getting to know other investors, being this connector between startups and customers and funding sources and regulators, and really always doing everything we can to help these companies succeed.
That's great. Thank you so much for those summaries. And Tibor, since you mentioned, I think it does bear us talking about the new climate legislation that just passed in Massachusetts. So Governor Baker signed the climate bill, and I don't know the particulars yet, but what I've seen is that it's calling for net zero emissions by 2050. And what I think is interesting about that is it really also brings the state level up to sort of the Boston city level climate action plan. So Jennie, for our Green Urban Commission work, I find that really interesting that now the Boston Green Ribbon Commission was convened to kind of work on this many things, but the climate goal of net zero by 2050, and then now the state is brought up to that level as well. And so, and I also know that the Massachusetts Clean Energy Plan is proposed to look at a 45% reduction in greenhouse gas by 2030. So sort of half by 2030, and then the rest by 2050. That's my latest. So correct me if I'm wrong.
Slightly wrong, but
okay. So, but then in addition to that, I wonder how you feel, each of you feel about that legislation. Does it encourage you? Does it feel like enough? And what would you change about it?
So maybe I'll jump in first, because I actually think Jennie's going to have the more insightful analysis on the policy. But let's say some of what I know, actually the net zero emissions target was already, net zero emissions target was set a year ago by the governor. The law that just passed is really more of a roadmap on how to get there, including a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030 and an 85% reduction in emissions by 2050. And so to get to net zero, it requires some other technology of ultimately either getting that 85% closer to 100% in combination with somehow other ways of taking essentially carbon, sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere to net to zero emissions. And that's sort of really interesting. I'm excited that those are like really aggressive targets. I think in some ways maybe the most aggressive on par with other states. Something else that was and generally there's a lot that's happened over the last year in terms of setting targets in transportation and buildings. The new climate bill actually does advance targets for energy efficiency in building codes, which I think is really needed to address. There's a huge stock of existing buildings, so it addresses both new and existing buildings. And to get to net zero, you can't do it just by making new buildings more efficient. You really have to, the most efficient, you really need to address the existing building stock. And on the generation side, it addresses what is sort of how do we, Massachusetts, the greatest resource we have access to decarbonize the grid is through offshore wind. And so it advanced what was already 1.6 gigawatts of, and frankly, again, I'll try not to boast too much, but like the first in the nation to be procuring large-scale offshore wind power. Some of those projects got slowed down, but now under the current federal administration are accelerating and getting the approvals they need to start construction. And the latest climate bill expanded what was 1.6 gigawatts to 4,000 megawatts or 4 gigawatts. Plus there's an option for DOER to procure an additional 1.6 gigawatts that's still outstanding. So that's gonna, that could provide a majority of Massachusetts consumption of electricity over the next decade and a half. And the other thing that's really exciting is that there is and I look forward to hearing Jennie's analysis on this. There's a introduction of sort of environmental justice, climate justice. I think the bill calls it environmental justice initiatives, with really an understanding that it's these environmental justice communities that tend to be hardest hit by climate change and least able to adapt and afford solutions to address that. Certain things that they're starting to introduce, like with MassCEC, there's now a social cost of carbon that's introduced into the calculation of cost effectiveness, which I think is really interesting, and new standards and codes for appliance efficiency targets, and so all of that's, I think, to me, sort of very exciting to see where this is going and really laying out that roadmap. with an appreciation for environmental justice. So having said that, Jennie, I'd love for you to kind of tear that apart and where it's good and bad, but I'm excited by it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the environmental justice component is among the most exciting parts of it in terms of the first time it's been so explicitly well defined what is environmental justice communities and how the assessment of cumulative impacts to those communities, and then also focusing on workforce development and thinking about the jobs and making sure that the jobs are also accessible and inclusive of workers from communities that have been harmed the most from. So I think one of the things to think about is that some of our previous climate policies have really exacerbated inequities and disparities by providing incentives and subsidies to privileged members of the Commonwealth. And so, that we can't do, we don't want to be doing that anymore, right? And so I think it's really 20 years of effort by a lot of social justice advocates and activists to get this environmental justice component to be so central in this legislation. So I think it was not easy to get it there, right? So I think a lot of there's definitely a sense of accomplishment and progress with that, and it's still somewhat disappointing how hard it was to get that there, right? And that's where this shift in thinking about the transformation away from a fossil fuel reliant society toward a renewable based society, thinking of that as like an opportunity to reinvest in people and communities that have been underinvested in for so long, is a shift that we're starting to get on, but we're not fully there. And some of the more conventional logics about supporting specific technological advances, not thinking about the distribution of who's profiting and who's being excluded and who's being included. We still have a lot of work to do to move away from that, to make sure that we are that all these new investments are inclusive and distributed in their benefit. I will just say at the national level, there's also some, exciting developments. Obviously, it's still early days with the Biden-Harris administration, but there's some advances and this way of thinking, particularly with the infrastructure bill and the recovery investments in and kind of this integrated way of thinking about climate energy mixed in with other things rather than separate, I think is a really promising approach. And I think it's necessary to make the kinds of transformative changes that are needed. I will also mention one of my colleagues and friends at Northeastern, Professor Shalonda Baker. She has a joint appointment with the School of Public Policy, where I am, and the law school. And she was just recently appointed in the Biden-Harris administration. She's Deputy Director for Energy Justice in the Department of Energy, which the Department of Energy has never before had that role, right? An energy justice high-level person who is responsible for designing and implementing the commitments that have been made about that energy and climate investments. In the campaign, they were saying 40% of all those investments are going to go directly, make sure those go to communities that have been underinvested and environmental justice communities. And so, that again, promising new approach and hopefully synergistic with other kinds of public investments that need to happen in this recovery period as well. So
that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's. Oh, go ahead,
yeah,
James.
Yeah. So Professor Stevens, that's great, and Professor Toth as well, and both are great. So could you guys give us some examples, since we are at the stage of climate justice? Could you guys both give us some example on what you see as some examples on who are the most vulnerable, and how specifically can we potentially lift them up? And we know that there are injustices existent, especially in the energy sector, that we're facing minorities are disproportionately hurt by not only climate change but also inequalities in our society. Professor Stevens, can you give us some concrete examples on this, and how do we lift them up? And Professor Toth, maybe examples on how the private sectors could potentially chip in and help on this.
Yeah, so in my book, I talk quite a bit about the how fossil fuels and our fossil fuel reliance has been disproportionately having negative health impacts as well as economic impacts on communities of color. If the NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program has done some really good work revealing the depths of the kinds of investments that have been made by fossil fuel industry to kind of manipulate communities to think that it's in their best interest and get support for fossil fuel infrastructure. And then those very same communities are often have very negative health impacts in terms of being exposed to toxics and other impacts of fossil fuel extraction and burning. And so I think that's kind of a pervasive trend. That's not, and there's a legacy there of this has been going on for decades. And so I think there's some really important, not just resisting that in the future, but then also acknowledging all the harm that has been done and how to make up for that, right? And support those communities. I guess I have one slide I was just going to show briefly here. Let me see if this will work. Just to show the power and influence of kind of what's happened over the past 4 years, four decades, sorry. Let me just share quickly. How's this working? Can you see something?
We can.
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, I'm trying to make it, yeah, maybe this isn't the best. I have this other things open, it's not clicking. So what I was going to show is the widening income and wealth gap over the past 4 decades. And that is very intentional and strategic by people who have been profiting over in the current situation with sustaining fossil fuel use. And there's been very active resistance of the polluter elite, the top 1% who are concentrating their wealth and power, and to resist renewable energy and to tell us that climate isn't a problem that we need to worry about, right? And to actually minimize our trust that government regulation is there to protect us and our health, and actually that it's somehow a bad thing for government to be protecting public health. So I mentioned that we don't always think about that in terms of climate and energy, but I think it's really important, especially now in the pandemic, when we see, even in the past year, the income and wealth gap has even gotten even worse, right? We're on such a devastating, unsustainable, unproductive, dangerous path with the billionaires getting richer and richer, basically exploitative over everyone else. And you know, that has to stop somehow, right? It's actually physically not possible to just keep doing this, and it's so unhealthy. You know, we're seeing the results of what happens when we haven't been resources and people have just been continually marginalized in unhealthy situations. And I mentioned that just as another thing about recovery and like how to connect the climate investments that are needed with what people and communities and households need. And it's really an opportunity to rethink our climate commitments in a more integrated and holistic way. And I think that's essential for it to be effective. So that's kind of one additional important point there.
Professor Toth, people believe that investors are billionaires. Well, at least that's the traditional wisdom. So make your case. Why what you're doing is actually supporting the mission that Professor Stevens has just laid out here.
Certainly, and I mean, one of the groups that we have co-invested with, including with a special bridges program I did last year, actually are explicitly billionaires. So Breakthrough Energy Ventures is a fund that was founded by Bill Gates and a bunch of his other billionaire friends or colleagues. But I mean, generally speaking, I think you know, our mission and the mission of others who focus in the sector is trying to address, I guess, first and foremost, the effects of climate change that, you know, indirectly then therefore are benefiting these EJ or climate justice communities. And then there's some companies that are you know, explicitly trying to address the community directly. You know, from within companies that we've been investing in. One of the companies, Transera, yeah, they were, I'd say for all of our entrepreneurs, I mean, the really fun and exciting thing of what I do is I get to work with these entrepreneurs who are some of the smartest people in the world who could be focusing on any kind of business or money-making opportunity, and they decide to devote themselves to you know, a climate solution. And so all of them, even if what they look like, we invested in a company called Levy. I mean, the whole reason that Levy came into being was because they wanted to eliminate plastic bottles and the plastic bottle waste. Both the energy that goes into manufacturing plastic bottles, filling them with water, just shipping them around, they saw as highly wasteful. And ultimately, they came up with a product that's an office water flavored and sparkling water dispenser. But you know, it got exciting for us because we actually did the math on the emissions throughout that value chain that they're eliminating. Well, I was going to say there's a company, Transera, that the founder was inspired because they were with a separate company. They were doing business in India, and they gave an air conditioning unit to someone on the staff and asked later, well, how is it? And she said, well, I haven't been using it because I can't afford to run it. It uses too much energy. And ultimately, that became his inspiration to start this company, Transera, which has a very high efficiency, cheap air conditioning technology, with the idea that that particularly in the developing world that's being kind of hardest hit by the effects of climate change, there's going to be a need to use more air conditioning, and it needs to be affordable by the masses and efficient, energy efficient and low operating costs for the masses, and ultimately not just be by virtue of there being this sort of snowball effect that, well, it's hotter, you need to use more air conditioning, you're using, creating more emissions, and it just makes the situation worse. Some of the companies that we backed here I mean, one area that you think about what is, you know, these solutions that are hard for you know, lower income households to afford, like putting solar on your roof, or you may not even have a roof to put solar on, and you want to be able to be accessible to solar, whether it's cost or physical circumstances. And so the couple of companies that we've backed are addressing kind of residential solar, community solar as a solution. One company, Solstice, has a terrific founder, Steph Spears, whose vision is, again, bringing solar for everyone, and they are helping to facilitate and reduce the cost of community solar across the country. Another company, Energy Sage, has developed an online marketplace for connecting consumers with installers in a very low friction, low cost way, drastically reduced customer acquisition costs, which coincidentally, it is now the soft costs of solar that is a majority of the installed cost for customers. And so the equipment has started to become cheaper and cheaper, and it's now less than half the cost of a solar installation is the actual physical equipment. And so Energy Sage created this online marketplace. Their average system that they quote through their platform is more than 20% cheaper than the median installation across the country. They've gained over 2% market share, and while they're this marketplace, they're doing more than 2% of solar installations across the country are being transacted through their marketplace. So they are effectively a top 10 virtual installer of solar. And what drives their success is really that they're providing that with much lower costs, and also being better about integrating financing solutions, being very transparent and informative about the different options, different technologies, different financing solutions, and then adding on other storage and heat pumps and other clean energy technologies as well.
Thank you, Professor Toth and Professor Stevens. Just a side note, you mentioned air conditioning, and we know from academic research that air conditioning has been one of the most effective adaptation strategies around the world in terms of, in the United States, AC reduced 90% of climate-related mortalities, and new studies have shown that AC increases student performance. And who are the people that elect AC? That tends to be communities that are most of color and poor income background. Mary.
Yes, thanks. So, I've been wanting to ask this question. So we're talking about technology. We're talking about the perspective, Jennie, that you talk about in your book, and it's personal to me, because I hear this perspective coming to me at Brandeis about, technology is gonna solve everything for us. So why do we need to do anything about climate change? So it goes back to your question, Jennie, about the role of higher ed, but also, you argue that framing climate change as a problem that can be solved by a technological solution is failing. And we hear all the time about how the cost of solar and wind is plummeting. And there's even the solar dominance hypothesis. I'm not sure if you've heard of this, but that solar plus storage will be able to provide at least half of electric power generation globally by 2030, simply because of the economics of it, because the economics will become so much more attractive than conventional fossil energy. And yet that also seems to be that kind of same technocratic perspective that, that we can just rely on the technology and we can keep kind of doing business as usual. And so I wonder your thoughts on that. I wonder, obviously we need the technology, but how do we also adapt our leadership and our institutions like higher ed to not fall into the trap of thinking that technology is going to save us?
Yeah, can everyone hear me? I'm having problems with my Zoom, so like I'm not having full functionality, but you can. Okay,
Yes,
good.
yeah.
Great. So I think a couple of things I'd like to respond there. I think one idea or concept or social movement that I think is really helpful here is this idea of energy democracy, which is about redistributing power literally and figuratively, right? So it's acknowledging this transition we're in, moving from a fossil fuel-based society to a renewable-based society. And what's so powerful and the reason it's revolutionary is not just one technology, it's not a technological substitution, it's a whole different system. And it's, and literally every community in the world has access to local renewable resources, right? Whether the sun shining or the wind blowing, or coastal communities may have wave and tidal and offshore wind. Inland communities also have geothermal energy, which is a source that we have not invested a lot in, but it's a very huge source of energy. So the other reason that renewable energy and this transformation is so revolutionary is that renewable energy is perpetual, abundant, free. Once you've figured out how to harness it, you have the technology to harness it. So and it can be distributed at lots of different scales. It can be, you know, a solar backpack, a building, or wide, or right? Like there's full spectrum of scale for local, for all kinds of social innovations, like new ways of owning the resources, new ways of distributing the benefits of the resources. And so that's why investing in renewable energy, we also just don't want to invest in renewable energy in a way that perpetuates the same problems, right? Our investments in renewable energy are actually an opportunity for us to change the way society is structured, right? And how the power dynamics and the concentrated power and wealth of the fossil fuel interests that have had such a deep influence on our policy and politics. So, you know, we could imagine a renewable-based future where there's a handful of multinational, dominant, powerful solar companies, solar dominance, right, that are just as unequal as our fossil fuel companies today. Or we can think about very intentionally distributing that, right, to have heterogeneous mix of different size companies, different kind of ownership models, have community owned, worker owned, and what that does is open up possibilities for very different societal benefits that have nothing to do with the greenhouse gas emission reductions and the climate benefits, but they are actually, and perhaps arguably even more important than the climate benefits, right? They could be like, so I think that's one way to think about it. In terms of the role of higher ed and thinking about what we can do in our universities, I think, you know, students are so concerned, right, about the future. Climate change has become a very generational issue because older people are like, well, what can we do about it? I'll be, you know, I don't have to worry about it. Young people are really scared. I have two daughters and their young adult daughters, and they are worried about the future, right? And not just the climate disruptions that are already, we are seeing much more frequent and intense, but also the economic future, right? Like the jobs of the future. People, it's much more tenuous and competitive, and nobody's, you know, only a few privileged people are kind of guaranteed economic security at this point. And that doesn't have to be the way it is. And so I think we really need to all listen to the youth and support our youth activists, and it's the Sunrise Movement and other coalitions, multi-generational coalitions of advocates and activists that have really pushed for and come on the national stage and changed the climate conversations in the past 2.5 years for this more integrated approach. The Green New Deal is the policy proposal structure framework that has been proposed, and obviously that got politicized, has gotten very politicized. And so whether or not we use those words, the Green New Deal, there are a lot of what we're seeing is currently other ways of integrating climate energy into these other investments in economics, in jobs, in workforce development and education and training that are so important. So I think at the universities and colleges and higher ed in general, we have an opportunity to also change the way we operate, right? And acknowledge our own role in perpetuating certain frameworks and assumptions about the future versus preparing people for disruption and more larger societal change. And I think, I think I mentioned this, that we are working on a climate justice action plan, right? Which is a way of moving it beyond the technological and the technocratic, and thinking about more explicitly, even about, we all have to think about our own, especially large established organizations that could be, we don't like to think of it this way, that we're contributing to the perpetuating inequities and climate injustices, but we all have to kind of hold ourselves accountable, hold the organizations we work for accountable, to make sure that we are trying to resist the dominant status quo kind of business as usual, right? And we really need some bigger changes. And so I think there's a lot of potential for getting involved in lots of different levels on our own campuses and in our academic work, or what we study and research and learn about, and the classes that we teach and the classes we all take as students, and integrating these issues more front and center so that students are, and we're all kind of more prepared for disruptions. We can't assume that the world is going to stay the same, because we know it's not, right? And we don't know exactly how quickly things are going to deteriorate in terms of more climate disruptions. But we know that it's going to get worse, right? And there's going to be new challenges, and all of us are going to have to be confronting those challenges and responding to them in ways, in best ways that we can. So the more we can be kind of prepared for that. So I guess that's another really important point. So far, we've been talking a lot about climate mitigation, but climate adaptation and resilience are really important too, because we're even if we stopped emitting everything right now, we're still locked into climate disruptions and climate change. So we also need to be really thinking about our vulnerabilities and the people and communities and households that are most vulnerable, and how can we help supporting and minimizing suffering associated with the various broad range of different kinds of climate disruptions that we're already experiencing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I heard a great analogy, and I'm forgetting where, about comparing greenhouse gas emissions to like filling a tub of water. I mean, you can slow down emissions, but even just a little bit is still filling the tub, and eventually you're not kind of mitigating the problem. You still need to ultimately deal with it, and and change is scary, but yeah, I'd say, Mary, you made a reference to my engineering background. My engineering degree is in manufacturing, and so like the one thing that I carry with me throughout my career is this constant focus on continual improvement and questioning how things are done and made, and like always looking at, you know, where can you be more efficient, more effective, and that's into sort of processes we use in the office to, you know, solutions in the marketplace. And just because something's been done a certain way, you know, doesn't mean that that's the best way to do it. And so I'm always focused on sort of continual change and improvement. And but I probably am otherwise more in this like technocratic camp of like, oh, you can, you need to focus on, there's a huge gap of like, yeah, existing technologies can provide the solutions that are needed to, but not in a cost-effective way, and not, you know, evenly, equally, equitably distributed. And so, yeah, you need to be able to continue to, I think, innovate solutions focused on cost, you know, equality, accessibility, and everything else, for it to really kind of have the outcomes that we want to see in the world. So I guess I do sort of, and some of that is ultimately providing incentives to the market, if you will, through policy, through somehow addressing kind of a cost on carbon and emissions that doesn't, you know, fairly exist today, but maybe, you know, government doesn't have the ability to kind of fully finance this, and so you need to somehow address between policy and innovation the adoption and you know, scaling up of solutions to address climate change. And it really is, I mean, back to Jennie's earlier comment, I mean, it's as much of a public health issue as anything else that needs to be addressed.
So we're about to approaching the end of the webinar, and there are questions from the audience that we do want both of you to reflect on. Professor Sally Warner asks, what are the most important skills for graduating university students to have if they want to get jobs in green startups or in green climate justice? Maybe Professor Stevens can take it first.
Sure. I think, you know, full range of skills in terms of being resourceful, strong communication skills. I think we're at a point where a lot of the jobs aren't necessarily going to be technological engineering jobs, right? A lot of it is about more of the implementation, deployment, and engagement, community engagement. So a lot of skills of communication and connectivity. And I think it's a very rapidly developing and sector. And so I think being nimble and, you know, kind of continually learning and adapting to this dynamic space is really important. So I think a lot of the skills are really related to kind of integrated skills, I guess, that and a commitment to being engaged in this kind of really important area. So I think there's a lot of exciting new opportunities on the horizon.
Professor Toth.
So I'm hard pressed to say that there's like any special set of skills per se. I mean, it's really anything, you know, when I think about the companies we work with, the organizations we work with, I mean, it is the same skills that any nonprofit, when I think about the folks that work with the Greentown Labs, or any any tech startup, I mean, we're hiring engineers and marketing people and sales people, and the skills that go into that is in fact, we're often having to, like in our little startups, compete with Google and big tech companies who are like offering higher salaries for the data science and other sort of expertise you need depending on the solution. I mean, the clean tech startups are machine learning, AI, data science companies, or they're sort of mechanical engineer, IoT device companies, or they're web-based cloud computing tech jobs, and so it's all of these different skills that can be applied to addressing climate issues. And one of the companies I've invested in, a company called WeSpire, their solution is just focused on creating behavioral change, and they work with big companies on employee engagement and activities that employees can do to change their behavior to reduce energy, water, waste in their both corporate and personal lives. And so I think it's for students, it's sort of finding what you're passionate about, and you'll find ways to apply the skills you have. One of the things that I mentioned earlier, and I just put into, whoops, let me put this into the chat box, is MassCEC does have an internship program. I just put the website for it, but we spend a lot of time, our workforce team, in signing up employers for clean energy jobs. And clean energy jobs means companies that are clean energy companies, or bigger companies that maybe have clean energy and sustainability jobs within a larger company. And students can sign up to and basically provide this matchmaking service of, if you want to have an internship in a clean energy job, you sign up. We match you up with different employers looking for your skills or background, and you have an opportunity to kind of work in the field. You have an opportunity to, and we end up placing hundreds of students every year, and I forget the number, whether 20% of those students end up going to work for a company that they've interned with during their college career. And so that's been really successful to give students an opportunity to see how their skills can be applied to real world situation and job. And so I encourage you to, if you're looking for a summer job, check out our internship program.
Thank you so much. I wish we had more time, because I know we have questions we didn't get to, and apologies to those of you in the audience, but I do want to be respectful of everyone's time, and just thank you both so much, Dr. Stevens, Professor Toth. It's been great to talk to you again. We could talk about this for so much longer, I know, but I really appreciate your being here. For those of you who are attending, we will be obviously making this available as a recording, so watch your inbox for that. And thank you again. We really appreciate your time, and keep going forward doing this great work.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for giving us the opportunity to speak here today.
Wonderful. Thanks. Good night.